have been hearing a lot about Peter Thiel's obsession with the Antichrist. And my first reaction was, well, that's not good. Remember we covered Peter Thiel on this channel in that video, Are You on the List? About the supposed master list that the Trump administration in Palantir is compiling on Americans. Now, he is instrumental in the progression of the surveillance state. It was already going, but he's helping it along. Thiel was also the mentor of Vice President JD Vance. So this is a man with a lot of money, a lot of power, and a lot of influence. So why is he obsessed with the Antichrist? Is he projecting here? Well, Wired has a feature article on the subject, and we will cover the important points here and find out if there's any there. Now, remember that Duncan Trussell, he recently got into a lot of hot water by going to one of Thiel's talks and saying that it was honestly pretty meh. So you tell me, is this stuff pretty meh? Now, the article is linked below. It is behind a paywall, but the first month is free if you want to sign up and then cancel, or if you like, you can keep going. The real stakes and real story of Peter Thiel's Antichrist obsession. 30 years ago, a peace-loving Austrian theologian spoke to Peter Thiel about the apocalyptic theories of Nazi jurist Carl Schmitt. They've been a roadmap for the billionaire ever since. Now, this story is by Lauren Bullard, and the art in this article is just great. It's just great. Can I just say that the optics of Peter Thiel talking about the Antichrist, they're bad. People are already suspect him of nefarious things, so when he says the A word, it's a little off-putting, but it has been a major point in his life. Now, from the article. To really grasp Thiel's catacon and Antichrist shtick, you need to go back to the first major lecture of his Doomsday Roadshow, which took place on an unusually hot day in Paris in 2023. No video cameras recorded the event and no reporters wrote about it, but I've been able to reconstruct it by talking to people who were there. Good call not having cameras at the event, by the way. Thiel knows what many of us have already figured out, which is that the public will not read. Now, this reconstruction is linked below, but no one's going to read it. If it were on video, they'd have clipped it to pieces and put it all over TikTok. Anyway, the venue was a yearly conference of scholars devoted to Thiel's chief intellectual influence, the late French-American theorist René Girard. René Girard was a French-American philosopher of social sciences, and he is best known for his work on desire. Now, Girard asserted that people only want what they want because other people want it. We're really not original thinkers. And because we all want the same thing, we come into conflict and we scapegoat a single person or group and blame them for the conflict that the mob or the group created. Now, to Girard, the Bible flips the script on this because Jesus was the scapegoat and Jesus was the hero in the Bible. Okay, keep that in mind. Back to the article. By Thiel's telling, the modern world is scared, way too scared of its own technology. Our listless and zombie age, he said, is marked by a growing hostility to innovation, plummeting fertility rates, too much yoga, and a culture mired in the endless Groundhog Day of the World Wide Web. But in its neurotic desperation to avoid technological Armageddon, the real threats of nuclear war, environmental catastrophe, runaway AI, modern civilization has become susceptible to something even more dangerous, the Antichrist. According to some Christian traditions, the Antichrist is a figure that will unify humanity under one rule before delivering us to the apocalypse. For Thiel, its evil is pretty much synonymous with any attempt to unite the world. How might such an Antichrist arise to power? Thiel asked. By playing on our fears of technology and seducing us into decadence with the Antichrist slogan, peace and safety. In other words, it would yoke together a terrified species by promising to rescue it from the apocalypse. So there was this one sensationalist headline I saw on Instagram, and it said basically, Peter Thiel thinks trying to regulate AI companies will lead to the Antichrist. And this is what that article was referring to. It was a headline. Someone promising to rein in tech companies will give these false promises, and that person will be the real Antichrist. Now, that is very convenient coming from the head of tech companies. Anyone who tries to limit me is clearly the Antichrist. Remember, the Antichrist will supposedly promise us peace and stability, and he will deliver us neither of these things. But things are pretty peaceful after the apocalypse. We don't hear much about dinosaur crime anymore. Let's contrast this with the AI scientists such as Geoffrey Hinton, who tell us that an AI apocalypse is a real possibility. Guess we are literally damned if we do and damned if we don't. All right, fine. Back to the article. By way of illustration, Thiel suggested that the Antichrist might appear in the form of someone like philosopher Nick Bostrom, an AI doomer who wrote a paper in 2019 proposing to erect an emergency system of global governance, predictive policing, and restrictions on technology. But it wasn't just Bostrom. Neil saw potential Antichrist in a whole zeitgeist of people and institutions focused single-mindedly on saving us from progress at any cost. Now, you may know Nick Bostrom. He's a futurist philosopher, and I know him best from his work on simulation theory that says that if a society is able to create an ancestor simulation, then it is most likely that we are living in an ancestor simulation. Now, that was a big talking point of the 2010s, and we have been talking about simulation theory a lot this past week on Patreon. It is a huge rabbit hole, and you can get stuck in there. We're not going to do that now, just FYI. Back to the article. When Thiel was finished, a moderator kicked off the Q&A session by noting, in so many words, that the speech had been a huge bummer. If the world was hurtling toward an apocalyptic crisis, he asked, what might the billionaire suggest we do? Fend off the Antichrist, came the reply. But beyond that, Thiel said that he, like Girard, wasn't really in the business of offering practical advice. A few moments later, someone in the audience stood and offered a correction. It's not true what you said about Girard, a man's voice said. On many occasions, the speaker went on, young people asked Girard, what should we do? And Girard told them to go to church. The voice belonged to Wolfgang Palaver, a 64-year-old theologian from Innsbruck, Austria. Now, since this initial lecture, Thiel has answered, go to church when people ask, what can we do to prevent the Antichrist? But according to the article, he doesn't specifically credit Palaver, nor does he credit him much with his other philosophies. Take from that what you will. Now, Palaver is the peaceful theologian mentioned in the headline of the article who introduced Thiel to Nazi jurist Carl Schmitt. Now, the article continues. A lifelong peace activist, he first wrote about Schmitt's apocalyptic theories in hopes of driving a stake through their heart. Yet for years now, Palaver has watched as his own Girardian take on Schmitt seemed to have provided a roadmap not only for Thiel's speaking tour, but for his considerable strategic intervention in global politics. From his investments in military tech to his role in shaping the careers of JD Vance and Donald Trump, to his support of the national conservatism movement. If Thiel takes his own thinking seriously, he seems to regard these moves as interventions in the end of human history. So for Palaver, his efforts to educate Thiel about Schmitt seem to have blown up in his face. Schmitt is a Nazi apologist who actually was a Nazi who justified Hitler's Night of the Long Knives. And Palaver is saying, can you believe that anyone would take this stuff seriously? And Thiel is saying, hold my beer. Well, not exactly that, but he is using these theories while he builds this massive military and surveillance system using tech, like he's actually daring the Antichrist to stop him. Whatever. The article says that Palaver and Thiel planned an event later, but it didn't go as planned. Palaver said he'd agreed to the event with Thiel in the hope of getting him to reconsider his positions. In my own months of conversations with Palaver, he said he fears that the investor has arrived at a potentially catastrophic interpretation of Schmitt. And that is why you don't help people, my friends. It's bound to blow up in your face. You teach a man to fish, and he fishes the oceans to extinction. No, you just sit there and you whittle and you mind your own business. That's my 2 cents. Now, the article gives a really interesting dynamic on the relationship between Thiel and Palaver, but we will not go into it here. It's actually very, very long. Remember, the important point was Palaver's comment, go to church, to prevent the rise of the Antichrist. Well, why is that? The article does explain. But the arrival of Christianity, Girard believed, marked a turning point in human consciousness because it revealed, once and for all, that scapegoats are actually innocent and the mobs are depraved. In the crucifixion narrative, Jesus is murdered in a heinous act of collective violence. But unlike nearly every other sacrificial myth, this one is told from the perspective of the scapegoat. And the audience cannot help but understand the injustice. With this epiphany, Girard wrote, The old scapegoating rituals instantly started to lose their effectiveness. Having been unmasked and discredited, humanity no longer gets the same relief from collective acts of violence. Communities still scapegoat all the time, but with less and less unifying cohesion to show for it. What awaits us at the end of history, then, is the unchecked, contagious, and ultimately apocalyptic violence of mimetic rivalry. Ooh, it looks like somebody predicted social media. Remember how mobs would swarm around people that the internet deemed to have sinned? Like every day it was somebody new. And now it's people who criticize Charlie Kirk. But just last week it was for racism or for misgendering or whatever it is that Kevin Hart did like 15 years ago. They just like to swarm. When 20th century philosophers predict something horrible and then you see it in real life, it's like finding an Easter egg in a movie. It's like, ooh, that's happening now. But then you gotta live it and you're like, ugh, yikes. Back to this article. The upside of the crucifixion narrative, however, is that it offers humanity moral redemption. For Girard, the conclusion was clear. No matter the end game, one must wholly reject scapegoating. Imitation remains inescapable, but we can choose our models, and the sound path forward, as he saw it, was to mimic Jesus, the one model who never became a fascinating rival in leading lives of Christian nonviolence. Now, this article says that in 1996, Thiel attended a conference where he heard Palaver speaking on Schmitt's theories on the Antichrist and the catacon. Now, the catacon is a figure from Christian mythology who holds back the Antichrist and delays the end of the world. But it's kind of flipped. Now, during the Second World War, Schmitt saw the globalist ambition of the USSR as presenting precisely this kind of apocalyptic risk, according to Palaver. Schmitt, he said, was desperate to locate a catacon, the shadowy figure referenced in Paul's second letter to the Thessalonians, who stands in the way of the Antichrist in order to hold off the end of the world. Schmitt's greatest failure, Palaver told his audience, had been to think that Hitler was the catacon, able to prevent the coming of a destructive world state. Well, that turned out well for everyone involved. As the article points out, the Nazis scapegoated the Jews, as well as the Roma and other people, and paved the way for world government, which was the United Nations. Also, why are we still basing our decisions off of a 2,000-year-old book from the most chaotic region in the world? One of our most powerful tech oligarchs is obsessed with Bible prophecy, like this is Midnight on the History Channel, and he wants to drag the rest of us along. Fantastic. That's just great. Next article. For anyone who wants to shape history, Palaver suggested there are two available courses of action. Follow in the footsteps of Schmitt or follow in the footsteps of Jesus. To follow Schmitt would be to invest in the catacon. But of course, the thing that's supposed to fight the Antichrist is just going to give rise to the Antichrist. And what we must do to prevent all of this is follow in the footsteps of Jesus Christ and to forgive, according to this theology, according to this mythology. Okay, but Thiel, the article goes on to say, actually follows Schmitt more than Jesus. We rejoin Thiel in the years following 9/11. Okay. Strangely for someone so suspicious of global unity, Thiel saw one such possibility for action in the creation of a worldwide surveillance network. Instead of the United Nations, filled with interminable and inconclusive parliamentary debates that resemble Shakespearean tales told by idiots, Thiel said, we should consider the secret coordination of the world's intelligence services as the decisive path to a truly global Pax Americana. This surveillance super system, Thiel wrote, could act as a political framework that operates outside the checks and balances of representative democracy as described in high school textbooks. Now, we see Thiel doing this in real time through Palantir and through his work with the US government. For a guy that doesn't want the Antichrist, Thiel is doing quite a lot to usher in the Antichrist. Now, soon after this lecture, Thiel invested in Facebook, and he said this about that. I bet on mimesis, Thiel would later say. LinkedIn intellectuals began referring to Girard as the godfather of the like button. One critic even speculated that Thiel saw Facebook as a mechanism for the containment and channeling of mimetic violence. Well, that certainly has backfired. Now, we covered mimetics, copying people. We ran into it in this recent video on Are Your Thoughts Even Your Own? I'm pointing to a thumbnail of that right now. You can check out that video if you are interested in learning more about that. Later, Schmitt, who Thiel draws heavily from, renounced Hitler for obvious reasons. He formed a new way of thinking about the Antichrist. In Schmitt's post-war book, The Nomos of the Earth, he pitched a new kind of catacomb. This would be a world order based on the equilibrium of several independent large blocks, as Palaver summarized it in 1996. In Schmitt's multipolar world order, each hegemonic power would have its own distinct culture, race, language, and national heritage. The world would be disunified by design. There would be no global regulatory bodies and no global enforcement mechanisms, no United Nations, no International Criminal Court. Honestly, this looks like the world that we are going into now, and the world that we kind of came out of, except for one brief period from like 1990 to 2020, where the US was the sole global superpower after the breakup of the Soviet Union. Now, I have some theories on how this might work, but that is not for this video. In 2023, Thiel returned to Schmitt's ideas yet again when he gave his first major lecture on the Antichrist before the Girardians in Paris. This time, he did refer obliquely to Schmitt's misadventure in nationalism, a cute way of referring to his vigorously prosecuted Nazism, and gave much more air to the idea of the catacomb. After Thiel finished his thought, and Palaver issued his go-to-church correction from the audience. So this is the lecture that we started with. Just on this one point, I actually agree with Thiel. So you supported the Nazis once. Does that mean everything that you do is worthless? Well, we didn't think so when we did Operation Paperclip in the 1950s. Those former Nazi scientists actually took us to space. So it is suspicious that Thiel is mimicking this Nazi apologist, but you have to give context in that they were all kind of like that at the time, and we just sort of yada, 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 the years 1933 to 1945 in Germany. They were going through a phase. They were going through a phase over there. A little bit of a bloody bender. Okay. Now, here's where it gets interesting for us, and we see Thiel's ambition at play. It's no secret that Vance is largely a product of Thiel. The billionaire has helped architect nearly every professional endeavor of Vance's adult life, including his meteoric political rise. After Vance converted to Catholicism in 2019, he published an essay in the Catholic magazine The Lamp, partly attributing his conversion to the influence of two men, Peter Thiel, he was possibly the smartest man I'd ever met, and the late René Girard. See, you're mad that JD Vance is in the pocket of Peter Thiel. I'm happy that at least one person in that administration is literate. You got to temper your expectations, people. You really do. In a recent interview, Thiel was asked whether or not Donald Trump might be the catacomb, and he refused to answer. His reticence to name a catacomb is a lesson he seems to take directly from Palaver's account of Schmitt and Hitler. I mean, I have heard many people who I find to be intelligent actually say that they suspect Donald Trump is the Antichrist, which is why I think it is sus that Thiel is such a close ally of Trump and getting involved in all of this. It seems contrary to this political philosophy, but I always felt the apocalypse would be ironic in a we're the butt of the joke kind of way. Most followers of Girard, they are not like Thiel. The article says they have no interest in creating scapegoats, even though they acknowledge that scapegoats are necessary to hold society together. They're just like, well, if this is what it takes, then it's not worth it. Respect. Respect to that point of view. This is what the article says. Palaver wanted to make sure that I understood that he too was concerned with scapegoating less. He seemed worried that I might be scapegoating Peter Thiel. The nature of journalism is scapegoating somebody. That's the business model. And the only way for us to get around it is if we all just smash our phones. Now, I am just going to say it. All of these people are thinking way too much. And I think a lot. And I'm like, geez, touch grass. Peter Thiel especially needs to touch grass because he's the ambitious one here. The rest of these guys are academics. They're worried about tweed and Earl Grey and stuff like that. They don't care about ambition. Anyway, the article ends. In a June interview, the conservative columnist Ross Douthat asked Thiel whether he, with his heavy investments in AI, military tech, and the data analysis firm Palantir, is actually building tools that work in the service of the Antichrist. The halting 6 seconds the men subsequently devoted to unpacking the idea, which immediately became a meme, were remarkably underwhelming.
The irony of history would be that the man publicly worrying about the Antichrist accidentally hastens his or her arrival.
There are all these different scenarios. I obviously don't think that that's what I'm doing.
To be clear, I don't think that's what you're doing either. I'm just interested in how you get to a world willing to submit to permanent authoritarian rule.
There's a tension between those two things, and in some way, he goes along with both of them. He, Palaver, told me. It's a good strategy if you have the means to have something at stake on all the sides. In other words, maybe the billionaire is hedging his bets, investing heavily in both the catacon and the one-world totalitarian Antichrist. Okay, so this is Peter Thiel's obsession with the Antichrist, according to Wired writer Lauren Bullard. It's a thorough piece of reporting that deserves to be behind a paywall. This was months of work, and I'm glad that Wired is still doing that level of journalism. It's a bit terrifying to think that one of our masters of the universe is this big of a Bible nerd. Those Palantir cats, they're really weird. And that's not a judgment. I'm just saying that when people are that weird, it's hard to relate to normal people, and it leads to very awkward answers like this.
You would prefer the human race to endure, right? You're hesitating.
Yeah, well,
yes?
I don't know. I would.
This is a long hesitation. This is a long hesitation.
There's so many questions implicit in this.
Just say that humans should live. How hard is that? Now, a lot of people have pointed out that Thiel is an anagram for the reptile, and once you see it, you can't really unsee it. Okay, so what do you think? Has this video made you more or less concerned with Peter Thiel's obsession with the Antichrist? Do you, like Duncan Trussell, think that this is all just really boring stuff? Or are you concerned that Thiel wields way too much power? Or do you think, well, at least he's thoughtful. At least he's thinking about something. You let me know in the comments. I will see you next week.